The Subcommittee on Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Communications will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to receive testimony regarding the efforts to defend our nation's food and agricultural sector. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Now, let me first say this is my last subcommittee hearing that I will be chairing. Technically, I've actually handed over the gavel to my good colleague here, Mr. Donovan from New York, but since we had planned this hearing, we decided to do our change of command ceremony at the end of the hearing. And so it's an absolute honor to have been chairing this subcommittee and working with my colleagues, my ranking member, Mr. Payne. I'll be remaining on the subcommittee, but I will be chairing the Border and Maritime Subcommittee now, and which is obviously quite important for my district, and looking forward to continued leadership opportunities. So anyway, back to the topic at hand. Throughout this Congress, this subcommittee on emergency preparedness, response, and communications has taken a deep dive into the world of biological terrorism. We've held hearings to assess the biological threat, understand the scope of the biodefense problem, and examine federal programs aimed at tackling some of the biodefense challenges. Our oversight thus far has primarily been on the human impacts of biological terrorism. Today, we're going to take a different perspective and look at the impacts to the nation from a terrorist attack on or natural disruption of our agricultural or food systems. An agri-terrorism attack would impact the most basic of human needs, the food we eat. Furthermore, the food and agricultural sector is critically important to our nation's economy. U.S. food and agriculture accounts for roughly 1/5 of the nation's economic activity, contributed $835 billion to the U.S. gross domestic product in 2014, and is responsible for 1 out of every 12 U.S. jobs. In my home state of Arizona, ranching and agriculture contributes around $10 billion a year to the state's economy. An intentional attack or natural disruption of U.S. agriculture or food, therefore, would present a serious threat to this nation and cause major economic damage on a number of levels. There will be costs related to containing disease and destruction of livestock, compensating farmers for loss of agricultural commodities and losses in other related industries, and trade embargoes imposed by other nations. Intelligence indicates that terrorists have discussed vulnerabilities in various components of this sector. Food and agriculture is an attractive target to terrorists because many agents are easy to obtain. Minimal technology is required to execute an attack, and our food travels across the country and world quickly and efficiently. Furthermore, even if there are a few human casualties, an agri-terrorism attack would also undermine public confidence in the government, increasing general concerns about the safety of our food supply, as well as the effectiveness of biological defense planning. This goes to the heart of what we know groups like ISIS are trying to do: terrorize by all means possible. We only need to look at the impacts of the highly pathogenic avian influenza, or HPAI, a natural event, to see how devastating an intentional act against our food or agriculture could be. Last year's outbreak of HPAI was the largest animal health incident in U.S. history, resulting in over $3 billion in economic losses and the slaughtering of 48 million birds to stem the spread of the disease. 18 trading partners banned all imports of U.S. poultry and products, and an additional 28 trading partners imposed partial bans. This outbreak and its rapid farm-to-farm spread highlighted the challenge the sector faces related to effective biosecurity, especially during a large-scale response. We must ensure we're able to assess our level of preparedness for any type of major disruption to U.S. food or agriculture. Our goal today is to gain a better understanding of what government, along with academia and the private sector, are doing to reduce vulnerabilities of the food and agricultural sector to a terrorist attack. We hope to gain a better understanding of the scope of the problem and identify ways in which we, as members of Congress, focused on Homeland Security issues, can help prevent attacks and improve our readiness and our ability to respond. I hope to hear about information sharing with the government. Is food and agriculture engaged in our process, including things like the fusion centers? Are you getting the threat and risk information that you need? I also want to understand your connectedness to the human health side of things. Are our current biosurveillance systems integrating the human, animal, and plant data to form one true One Health picture? With that, I welcome our witnesses, and I look forward to your testimony. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne, for any opening statement he may have.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning to all here. I would like to thank Subcommittee Chair, Ms. McSally, for holding today's hearing. And Madam Chair, I wish you the best of luck as you take over the Subcommittee on Border and Maritime Security. Biological threats are evolving. As these threats evolve, so does our perspective about how we can best protect against the damage that they can inflict. This subcommittee has historically focused on the human health impact of the biological threats. I am pleased that we are expanding the scope of our oversight to include the impact to U.S. agriculture and food supply. I represent the 10th Congressional District of the state of New Jersey. Now, my district is not known for its rolling fields of corn, hog pens, or open cattle ranges. It is, however, home of the Port of Newark and Newark Liberty International Airport. Customs and Border Protection agriculture specialists at the airport clear up to 20,000 passengers every day. At Port Newark, one of the busiest ports on the East Coast, specialists inspect imported food items, marble slabs, tiles, and wood packing material, all of which can carry insects and other snails that could harm our domestic agriculture. Yet, just this week I heard the CPB employees in my district about insufficient agricultural specialist staffing. The Port of Newark and Newark International Airport are top performing ports with top interception numbers and several first-in-the-nation insect finds. But I am concerned that unless the staffing challenges are resolved, there is a risk that a new foreign insect could go undetected and do harm to the agricultural industry and the safety of the food supply. Although I recognize that we may not be able to stop every dangerous insect or pathogen from entering our borders, we must be vigilant. With that said, I also recognize that there are domestic risks to the agriculture industry and the food supply related to natural disasters and emerging diseasing and bad actors. Last year, for example, an avian influenza outbreak was responsible for nearly $400 million in losses to the egg and poultry industry. And consumers paid the price at the grocery store. Although the avian influenza was a naturally occurring event, the financial losses sustained served as a sobering example of the economic damage that a significant agriculture incident could inflict. The food and agricultural industry is valued at nearly $1 trillion in the United States, and it is critically to open the American people is without question. That is why the federal government has designated the food and agriculture sector a critical infrastructure sector since 2003. Although there are multiple efforts to enhance the security of the agricultural industry underway at the federal and state level, as well as within the industry, significant challenges remain. For example, earlier this month, this subcommittee held a hearing on the Department of Homeland Security's struggle to achieve a national biosurveillance capability to collect and analyze biosurveillance data related to human health, animal health, and plant health. Unfortunately, this DHS National Biosurveillance Integration Center has struggled to effectively execute its mission for nearly a decade to the detriment of efforts to improve the agricultural biosurveillance capabilities. I'll be interested to know what, if any, recommendations the witnesses have to improve the national biosurveillance capability in that regard. Additionally, I will be interested in understanding how information related to emerging diseases, emergency planning for natural disasters, and terrorist threats is shared with stakeholders in the agricultural industry and whether the information is actionable. Finally, I'm eager to learn from our witnesses how the private sector, educational institutions, and non-government entities can play an active role in developing and enhancing biosecurity protocols for the agricultural industry as a whole. I thank the witnesses for being here today. I look forward to hearing the testimony. And Madam Chair, with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ranking Member Payne. Other members of the subcommittee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We're pleased to have a very distinguished panel before us today on this important topic. Dr. Doug Meckes is the North Carolina State Veterinarian, a position he has held since 2014. Prior to that, Dr. Meckes served as the branch chief for Food, Agriculture, and Veterinary Defense at U.S. Department of Homeland Security, where he provided oversight and management of the department's implementation of Homeland Security Presidential Directive 9, Defense of the United States Agriculture and Food, integrating the efforts of other DHS components and coordinating those efforts with appropriate federal departments and agencies, tribal, state, and local governments, and the private sector. Dr. Tammy Beckham is Dean of the College of Veterinary Medicine at Kansas State University, a position she assumed in August 2015. Prior to her current position, Dr. Beckham served as the director of the Institute for Infectious Animal Diseases, or IIAD, a Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence in College Station, Texas, where she led the IIAD's effort to perform research and develop products to defend the nation from high-consequence foreign animal, emerging, and zoonotic diseases. Did I say that right? Excellent. I was a pre-med biology major in college. My professors would not be proud of me. Anyway, Dr. Beckham also served as director of the Texas A&M Veterinary Medical Diagnostics Laboratory, where she provided leadership for its 2 full-service laboratories and 2 poultry laboratories, and directs one of the highest volume animal diagnostic labs in the country. Previously, Dr. Beckham was director of the Foreign Animal Disease Diagnostics Laboratory, part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Plum Island Animal Disease Center in New York. Her responsibilities included managing the diagnosis of animal diseases, overseeing diagnostic test development for a nationwide animal health diagnostic system, and coordinating efforts with the Department of Homeland Security and National Animal Health Laboratory Networks and other entities. Dr. Bobby Acord has been a consultant for the National Pork Producers Council since 2004. Prior to that, Mr. Acord served as administrator for the U.S. Department of Agricultural, Animal, and Plant Health Inspection Services from 2001 to 2004. As APHIS, is that how you pronounce that? As APHIS administrator, Mr. Acord was responsible for protecting U.S. agricultural health from exotic pests and diseases, administering the Animal Welfare Act, and carrying out wildlife damage management activities. Mr. Acord served as APHIS's associate administrator from 1999 to 2001. Prior to that, he served nearly a decade as deputy administrator for APHIS's Wildlife Services Program. Dr. Brian Williams is an assistant extension professor at the Mississippi State University Department of Agricultural Economics. Dr. Williams focuses on the primary areas of commodity marketing, farm management, production economics, and agricultural policy. Since joining the department, he has served as a member of the Mississippi State University Disaster Response Team, where he has focused on assessing damage to the agricultural sector after natural disasters. The witnesses' full written statements will appear in the record. The chair now recognizes Dr. Meckes for 5 minutes.
Red light. Chairman McSally, Ranking Member Payne, members of the House Subcommittee on Preparedness, Response, and Communications. My name is Doug Meckes, and I'm the State Veterinarian and the Director of the Veterinary Division in North Carolina's Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. The division serves the poultry industry, the livestock industry, and manages and operates 4 veterinary diagnostic laboratories in North Carolina. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today about North Carolina's ongoing efforts to prepare for, respond to, and communicate with stakeholders during agricultural emergencies. North Carolina enjoys a robust agriculture and agribusiness industry which contributes nearly $80 billion annually to North Carolina's economy. 67% of that figure is associated with animal agriculture. The industry accounts for 17% of state's income and employs 16% of the workforce. Chairman McSally and Ranking Member Payne have spoken knowledgeably about the food and ag sectors writ large, and I will not speak to that. But mindful of the contributions of the food and ag sector to the nation, in January 2004, Homeland Security Presidential Directive 9 was released and established a national policy to defend agriculture, food, and food systems against terrorist attacks, major disasters, and other emergencies. Included in HSPD 9 were 18 line items which provide guidance to address then identified gaps in our nation's ability to identify agriculture and food. 12 years later, gaps remain in our efforts to fulfill the HSPD 9 directives. I will speak to North Carolina's concerns over 3 of those gaps today: federal, state, and local response capabilities, availability of vaccine for foot and mouth disease, and the National Animal Health Laboratory Network resources. Line item 14 of HSPD 9 directs participating departments and agencies to ensure that the federal, state, and local response capabilities are adequate to respond effectively to a terrorist attack, to major disease outbreak, or other disaster. Even before HSPD 9, my predecessors in North Carolina recognized the need for such capability, and that need was precipitated by a series of events in the state, in the nation, and internationally. In September 1999, Hurricane Floyd made landfall in North Carolina, and that resulted in $813 million in agriculture losses. In February of 2001, an outbreak of foot and mouth disease in the United Kingdom caused a crisis in agriculture and tourism. And finally, 9/11 brought new concerns of attacks on our agriculture and food systems. The likelihood of agro-terrorism, the deliberate introduction of animal or plant disease for the purpose of generating fear and causing economic losses and undermining social stability took on new meaning. In the midst of these events, North Carolina's Veterinary Division launched an effort to meet the challenges of agriculture and food in the 21st century. As a result, the Emergency Programs Division was created within the department to reduce the vulnerability, minimize the impact of any natural or man-made disaster, disease, or terrorist attack, and to facilitate a rapid return to normalcy. Today, the Emergency Programs Division within North Carolina has reached maturity and has more than fulfilled its all-hazards response mission. Development of this capability has been funded by state and various federal grants. $18 million in state funds, $7.3 million in federal funds, a relatively small investment over the years. Consider what similar investments might have meant to states so profoundly affected by HPAI. Iowa and Minnesota experienced $1.6 to $1.8 billion in economic losses as a result of HPAI on 180 premises. Continued federal, state funding will be necessary to maintain current capability, to develop new capability, to train, to exercise, to replace equipment as needed. Unfortunately, funding for North Carolina's Emergency Program Division continues to decline and places the state's preparedness and response capability at risk. North Carolina's second concern, line item 18A of HSPD 9, speaks to the necessity of developing a national veterinary stockpile containing sufficient amounts of animal vaccine, antivirals, therapeutic products to appropriately respond to the most damaging animal diseases. Foremost in the minds of states with significant animal agriculture production is the possibility of a foot and mouth disease outbreak. Certainly that's the case in North Carolina, home to 9 million hogs. The size, the structure, the efficiency, and the extensive movement inherent in U.S. livestock industry will present unprecedented challenges in the event of an FMD outbreak. Control of such an outbreak in livestock-dense areas will require tens of millions of doses of foot and mouth disease vaccine. However, there are not tens of millions of doses of foot and mouth disease available, not anywhere in the world, because there is no excess production capacity. Current production meets daily needs, and there is no excess capacity. The reality has been evident since 2004 when the National Veterinary Stockpile was created, but there's never been sufficient funding for the stockpile foot and mouth disease vaccines. FMD remains North Carolina's animals agriculture's greatest threat. The pork industry, the economy, communities, businesses, and families in North Carolina would be devastated by a foot and mouth disease outbreak. A cooperative, collaborative effort, which includes all stakeholders, must be initiated to develop and implement a plan for establishing an effective FMD stockpile. North Carolina's third concern is veterinary diagnostic laboratory capability. Line item 8, HSPD 9, directs departments and agencies to develop a nationwide laboratory network for food, veterinary, plant health, and water resources that integrate federal and state laboratory resources. The National Animal Health Laboratory Network was created as a result of this directive and is now part of the nationwide strategy to coordinate the the work of all organizations providing animal disease surveillance and testing services. North Carolina's veterinary diagnostic laboratory system is a part of NOM, effectively surveils for and diagnoses animal and zoonotic diseases every day. However, state and federal support of and full funding for the nation's NOM laboratory system are necessary to optimize capability. The absence of full funding for the NOM was recently noted in the bipartisan report of the Blue Ribbon Study Panel on Biodefense, which stated, the NOM has struggled to maintain even $10 million worth of annual funding. Its appropriations cut over the years to pay for other programs. As a result, laboratories are unable to meet the threat and have at times eliminated positions and testing capacity for foreign animal diseases. After struggling for years to obtain sufficient funding, Congress in 2014 authorized a specific funding line for NOM at $15 million. NOM must be funded at this authorized level in order to meet the need. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today on behalf of North Carolina about issues concerned related to the defense of food and agriculture. I'm happy to address any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Meckes. The chair now recognizes Dr. Beckham for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman McSally, Ranking Member Payne, and members of the House Subcommittee on Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Communications. My name is Tammy Beckham, and I am the Dean of the Kansas State College of Veterinary Medicine. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today about the role that academia plays in defending our nation's agriculture and food. As I testify before you today, U.S. citizens reap the benefits of a robust agricultural industry that provides them with access to a safe, abundant, and affordable food supply. The very elements that make the U.S. agricultural system robust and productive also make it more vulnerable to a natural or intentional introduction of a biological agent. In fact, perhaps now more than ever, and any time in our history, our agricultural industries are at risk from a variety of threats that have the potential to severely disrupt our economy, our food supply, and cause great harm to our public health sector. Threats to our U.S. agricultural sector can come in a variety of forms to include a natural or intentional introduction of a foreign animal emerging and/or zoonotic disease. Many of the agents that are on the list of those most likely to be utilized to execute an agro-terror event, such as foot and mouth disease, African swine fever, or Ebola, are readily available in countries throughout the world, and in particular in countries in which terrorist groups such as the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and others who intend to harm the U.S. operate. Studies indicate that impacts from a natural or intentional introduction of any of these agents could lead to devastating economic and public health implications, with the most recent study that was completed by researchers at Kansas State University predicting that the cost associated with foot and mouth disease outbreak could result in a total of $188 billion in losses. Our ability to defend the U.S. livestock industries from these threats is heavily dependent on a coordinated, collaborative, and comprehensive approach involving state and federal government, law enforcement, industry, both biopharma and livestock, and academia. Since 2002, with the formation of DHS and the release of HSPD 9 and HSPD 10, the role of academia in supporting the Homeland Security mission has broadened. Academia, and in particular land-grant universities, play a very unique and critical role in supporting the agricultural defense mission. Working with our stakeholders and federal partners, we perform cutting-edge research, we innovate, we develop countermeasures and solutions and technologies that can support our industry during peacetime as well as during a disease outbreak. Our ability to work in each segment of the development pipeline, provide subject matter expertise, perform research to address specific questions, and act as a hub for reach-back capabilities are just some of the attributes that make academia such a strong and vital partner. Through our outreach mission, we work diligently to educate producers, stakeholders, and the public about novel technologies, policies, biosecurity practices, and threats to the sector. We have strong relationships with our stakeholders that are built on trust and understanding, and perhaps most importantly to Homeland Security, provide a venue for a brokered, unbiased discussion and communication between the state and federal government and our agricultural sector. Academia is in a unique position to facilitate discussions between the public and private sector, and oftentimes works to bridge the communication and trust gap so that solutions to complex challenges can be found. Simply stated, we are capable of acting as a trusted partner in what can sometimes be a very complex relationship. Colleges of veterinary medicine and agriculture across the U.S. are playing what is arguably their most important role in Homeland Security, and that is teaching, training, and preparing the next generation of Homeland Security workforce. Our graduates do indeed understand the role of animal health in the success of the nation's agricultural system, and they further recognize that veterinarians serve as the first line of defense in identifying incursions of transboundary, emerging, and/or zoonotic diseases. And I would be remiss not to mention that on a site adjacent to the Kansas State University College of Veterinary Medicine, DHS is currently constructing the National Bio and Agro Defense Facility. Needless to say, close collaboration between NBAF and the KSU CVM and its allied partners presents an inestimable opportunity to further strengthen resources for addressing the threats to the U.S. agriculture and food systems. There's a need to allocate adequate resources as well to address the nation's vulnerability in this area. Efforts such as the DHS Centers of Excellence should receive additional resourcing. Additional funds should be provided for agro-defense-focused research through avenues such as the USDA National Institute for Food and Ag, or NIFA, the National Institutes of Health, and lastly, but certainly not least, through increased funding for programs that will be housed within the National Bio and Agro-Defense Facility. Indeed, with construction of a state-of-the-art $1.25 billion facility, it is critical to ensure a stable and appropriate level of resources and funding for the research, training, and diagnostic missions that will be housed within it. Current budgets for the USDA APHIS, ARS, and DHS S&T at Plum Island do not account for the planned expansion of the programs in research, diagnostic, and training that will occur in the new NBAF facility. So I urge you today to increase agency programmatic budgets in the future for the NBAF mission so that the full potential of the facility and its DHS and USDA programs and partnerships to include the National Animal Health Laboratory Network can be achieved. In summary, addressing the threat posed by the intentional or unintentional introduction of a high-consequence disease is a collaborative process. The role of academia in this challenge is but one component of a much broader solution. Preparedness is and will be dependent on a holistic, all-of-enterprise approach, and solving this sector's complex problems and supporting our livestock and allied industries will depend on a strong public-private partnership that is built on trust, collaboration, and resolve. And finally, Chairman McSally, Ranking Member Payne, and members of the subcommittee, I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Beckham. The chair now recognizes Mr. Acord for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member Payne, members of the subcommittee, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the agriculture industry, and the U.S. food supply always have been at great risk from pest and disease. That risk has continued to increase over the years because of increases in travel, tourism, and trade. Each passenger handbag, each piece of luggage brought into the United States poses a risk. Every parcel mailed to the U.S. poses a risk. Large volumes of commodities and products from a wide range of countries are transported legally and some illegally to the United States every year by different conveyances, all of which may be carrying a disease or a hitchhiking pest. And now the country faces a new risk, terrorists weaponizing disease to inflict harm on the U.S. economy. Of particular concern to the livestock industry is foot and mouth disease. It's a highly contagious viral disease affecting all cloven-hoofed animals. The estimated 1 million pigs mouth disease outbreak from culling all infected and exposed animals has no capability of finding or of producing a sufficient quantity to deal with an outbreak in the U.S. The livestock industry has made it clear that a solution to the vaccine shortage must include a contract for an offshore vendor-maintained bank that includes antigen for all 23 FMD types that are currently circulating in the world, and that a contract be awarded for surge capacity to produce sufficient quantities of vaccine in the event of an outbreak in the livestock herd. There are gaps in the U.S. biosecurity system. In most outbreaks, the first problem encountered is the lack of biosecurity, which contributes to the spread of the disease. One solution to this problem is that in addition to test exercises, federal and state agencies need a more robust review of biosecurity measures in each section of the agriculture industry. We need more robust scrutiny of imports. Federal agencies are relying too much on the ports of entry as the first line of defense against pest and disease introduction. More emphasis must be placed on what happens during processing and production of products in the countries of origin. We had an outbreak of porcine epidemic diarrhea in the United States in 2013, and the means and the method by which that introduction was brought to the U.S. has never been discovered. If that gap in the security system is still open, then it's open for FMD and all other diseases as well. We have a serious problem with animal traceability in this country. It's inadequate for the use in an animal disease outbreak. In fact, it's not even recognized as adequate to meet the requirements of some of the major U.S. trading partners. Many of the shortfalls identified today are the result of lack of adequate resources. Risks to U.S. agriculture and the U.S. food supply have increased dramatically over the last few years and have now been exacerbated by the threat of terrorists targeting agricultural production. At the same time, funding provided to maintain the country's safeguarding system has been reduced. We simply can't have it both ways. In conclusion, there seems to be a growing consensus that there are serious flaws in the country's preparedness to deal with threats to the U.S. agriculture and the food supply. The bipartisan report of the Blue Ribbon Study Panel on Biodefense highlighted the need for improvements in the system for protecting U.S. livestock herd and the nation's food supply. A lot of information has been gathered from that report, from the hearings that you've held, from hearings that have been held in the Department of Agriculture, or by the Committee on Agriculture. There's a lot of information that's now been developed, and it seems that from the perspective of the National Pork Producers Council and probably more largely the livestock industry, it's now time to take action and to work with the Obama administration to let's fill these gaps and let's not continue to just look, let's act at this point. Thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Acord. The chair now recognizes Mr. Williams for 5 minutes.
Chairman McSally and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear today to talk about the risk that our nation faces from agri-terrorism. As an ag economist at Mississippi State University, I spend a large portion of my time researching ag markets and the impacts that shocks can have to those markets. Our country's ag and food production system faces many challenges today, one of which is the risk of a major disruption to the system. It is essential that we be prepared to face these threats to prevent and/or minimize the impacts they may have on our food system. As mentioned by my fellow witnesses, our poultry industry faced a devastating avian influenza outbreak in 2015. In Iowa alone, 30 million layers were lost and 1.5 million turkeys were lost, resulting in a direct impact of $658 million. Other industries are also impacted. This is known as a multiplier effect, and that multiplier effect resulted in a total economic impact of $1.2 billion and more than 8,000 jobs lost. On a positive note, some of those losses in Iowa were partially offset with increases in sales in other states. Mississippi alone, egg producers in the state saw a 40% year-over-year increase in sales. Keep in mind, those increased egg prices were also passed on to consumers, so there's a negative on that side of things, on that side as well. Prior to the avian influenza outbreak, the poultry industry already had several biosecurity measures put in place by companies such as Sanderson Farms and Tyson, who own the birds and contract the producers to grow and raise those birds. The state and federal agencies also helped to develop those guidelines. Despite all of these measures that were already in place, the industry was not prepared for an outbreak when disaster struck. In the time since the outbreak, industry leaders, state agencies, and federal agencies have all come together to develop a plan to quickly and efficiently address future outbreaks. This can also be applied to agri-terrorism and provides an excellent framework for other industries to work from. One benefit of agriculture is that production is spread over a wide area. As a result, natural disasters and other disruptions are quite common, but typically have minimal impacts. For example, the snowstorm about a month ago that hit the state of Nebraska, Iowa, Colorado, and Kansas all but shut down the meat packing industry for nearly 2 days. Yet the markets didn't respond to that shock. Another example, a similar snowstorm earlier this year in Texas and New Mexico killed more than 30,000 dairy cows and caused significant damage on a local level. Yet nationally, The milk futures only increased for a week before returning to their previous levels. One of the greatest threats from agri-terrorism that we face is the introduction of something that can shut down our export industry. An example of this is in 2003 when we had a BSE, a cow test positive for BSE in Washington State that shut down our export industry on our beef cattle. It took 7 years for exports to return back to the level that they were before that positive test of BSE. But despite that shutdown in exports, the cattle markets really were not impacted on a large scale. Moving on to our crop industry, with fruits and vegetables, the biggest threat that we really face is something that can potentially harm us as humans, the introduction of E. coli or salmonella. Our fruits and vegetables are typically grown outdoors in the ground, many of them very close to the ground, so they're susceptible to contamination, whether it be natural from birds or introduced from terrorists. While there's a system in place to detect and track these introductions, there's still definitely room for improvement in that area. Row crops are much less susceptible to agri-terrorism and natural disasters. The damage must be on a large scale to have a significant impact on the nation's economy. The biggest threat that we face right now is drought, a widespread drought, as we saw in 2012. The 2012 drought took nearly 3 years for our nation's row crop industry to really get back to normal levels. The other thing to keep in mind on that side of things is the conditions have to be nearly perfect at the field level for a terrorist to introduce a pathogen that would really take hold and spread. And so the likelihood of that is not very high. In conclusion, past incidences of disruptions have shown the U.S. ag sector is remarkably resilient. In most cases, it would be difficult for a producer to inflict damage on a large enough scale, with the exception of possibly our foot and mouth disease and some of these diseases in the livestock sector, to cause a national impact. What's really key to minimizing these effects is to take measures to keep them at a localized level. If these impacts are at a localized level, our ag sector has shown a remarkable ability to bounce back from these types of incidences.
Great, thank you, Dr. Williams. Chair, I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. A lot of them stewing here, but I want to be efficient with my time and give my colleagues an opportunity to ask questions. This committee has very much been focusing on the fusion centers and information sharing, not just between federal partners, but between federal, state, and local, not just on the government side, but with the private sector and others that would need a place or maybe can be a place regionally or statewide to come together and get the information that they need on threats and sharing information in both directions. I'd love to hear perspectives from any of the witnesses on whether you have been invited or involved in any of your fusion centers, or whether that's an area that we also need to improve to be inviting members related to agricultural industry to address the agri-terrorism threat, have that information be shared at the fusion centers.
Chairman McSally, I'll speak to our situation in North Carolina. As I indicated, the Emergency Programs Division came into being in 2002, and they have been intimately involved with law enforcement, with our emergency management response teams all across the state of North Carolina, with the fusion centers. And again, I would suggest that the Emergency Programs Division model might be something that other states would consider, because it's taken the burden of trying to manage that piece of agriculture and food defense off of our veterinary division, in that this group focuses solely on what's needed for response. And of course, we are integrated with them on a day-to-day basis in all the activities. So yes, in answer to your question, North Carolina does have input and does receive input from the fusion centers and emergency management.
Is that all virtual, or do you have somebody who's invited there or sits there if something were to break out? Are there tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTPs, for you to have somebody there, or how does that work?
In our planning for high-path avian influenza, we actively engaged immediately our Emergency Operations Center for the state of North Carolina, and we would have run the incident out of that Emergency Operations Center.
Okay, great. Any other witnesses care to comment on the Fusion Center? Mr. Acord?
To my knowledge, there's been no discussion or contact from those centers with the pork industry. I haven't heard of any. I can make you aware of one circumstance where communication is not good, and that's with the National Animal Health Laboratory Network. The challenge that we have there is that most of these laboratories can't communicate with each other, and that's serious consequence of not being able to immediately post what you find in a laboratory in Minnesota or in Iowa, in Kansas, and that has to be fixed if we're going to have an effective system, and it currently doesn't work.
Interesting. Dr. Beckham?
That goes back to biosurveillance and having the ability for systems to communicate with each other, to include the laboratory systems. As currently stands right now, the ability for those labs to message test results and communicate with one another, as Dr. Acord says, is not as robust as it could be. In addition, getting information from the field, from the veterinarians to the state animal health official or to other officials that need to have that information. Right now, there's not a really robust system out there for that. There are some efforts underway that are all of enterprise efforts from the industries to the state animal health officials to the federal government that have been funded by the Department of Homeland Security and that are being coordinated with USDA to develop surveillance systems that ultimately can talk between each other and the diagnostic labs. But to date, obviously, that's still underway, and that has not reached its full potential, much less even broached the idea of communicating with our public health sector.
So, well, we had a hearing about 2 weeks ago taking a look at biosurveillance systems and particularly looking at the National Biosurveillance Integration Center. So is that the place where this, I mean, there's a lot of shortfalls and shortcomings to that, but is in Nirvana, in a perfect world, is that the place that should be integrating this information in a very two-way and then across, regionally as well?
So I think there's some challenges associated with that, and I think some of the challenges are the willingness to share information. And someone has to act as a trusted agent, which is kind of what I alluded to in my testimony. The industries, I believe, are willing to share information, but that information has to be protected, and there has to be clear policies and procedures on how one will react to certain types of information. So those things need to be worked out, and I think, one of the projects that I had previously worked on in academia with industry was really headed that way so that you could get people to share information. But more importantly than getting them to share, you got to give them something back for it. Right. They can't just give you information and you not give them anything back. So it's a two-way street. There has to be good communication, and there has to be trust. And I'm not sure that MBIC is the place for that. I would let my other witnesses up here comment on that. I think Doug is ready to do that. But I can sure tell you that academia is a good place, or maybe another third party that can act as a trusted agent would be a great place to hold information or to share information. I'll say one more thing. And the unique thing about some of the systems out there now is that you actually don't even have to hold the information. You can reach back to that. Therefore, it stays with the owner, the actual owner of the information. And so that's another way of getting access to information and being able to utilize information, but not storing information in big databases, which can sometimes be very scary.
As you were saying that, it just made me think of a parallel that we've had a challenge with the cyber security and information sharing amongst the private sector and with the government. And we actually passed legislation out of this committee providing some protections to the private sector to build that trust and liability issues so that there could be sharing of what the appropriate threat information is. So I wonder if that's a model to look at for a similar challenge within this industry. I have some more questions, but I'm out of time, so I'll go on a second round here. So I want to give some time to Ranking Member Payne for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let's see, this question is for all the witnesses. What is the biggest gap in our ability to prevent and mitigate the effects of an agro-terrorism event? And what is the most critical investment we can make to prevent such an event?
Early detection. Early detection is key, right? So we've got to know something is here. We've got to be able to localize it, keep it localized. So early detection, biosurveillance, the National Animal Health Laboratory Network, the investment of these laboratories, the investment of that infrastructure is absolutely critical. You heard earlier today, vaccines are an issue for foot and mouth disease. I'll take that one step further. Look at the funding we put into HHS and the funding in the Strategic National Stockpile, and then compare that to what we put into the National Veterinary Stockpile. We do not have the funding to prepare this nation to respond to with vaccines and diagnostics that we need. And so I would say that's a large gap as well. So for me, it's early detection and then the countermeasures to respond, but the funding has to be there, similar to what we see on the human side of the house. If we have a zoonotic disease incursion, we've got to have the capabilities to respond, and in order to do that, we've got to have the resources allocated before. We cannot be reactive, we have to be proactive.
And just to provide an order of magnitude of the funding for the National Veterinary Stockpile, $1 to $2 million per year. Contrast that to the Strategic National Stockpile, which is $3 to $4 billion a year. I suspect the Strategic National Stockpile throws away more drugs that are expired on an annual basis than the entire budget of the National Veterinary Stockpile. We have to begin to address that issue. Foot and mouth disease is the barbarians at the gates. It's just a matter of time before it's introduced into this country, and we cannot stop the spread of that disease.
For the livestock industry, I think it would have to be an adequate supply of foot and mouth disease vaccine. That is really the thing that scares us the most. I agree with Dr. Beckham that early detection, rapid response is the mantra that we have to follow. But we know right now that we do not have an adequate supply of FMD vaccine, nor do we even have a vaccine for something like African swine fever that has spread rapidly through Russia and into to Eastern Europe. It's only a matter of time before it moves elsewhere. And we have to address those things. We can't continue to talk about it. USDA puts in about $1.9 million into the vaccine bank. That's a pittance compared to the loss that we would suffer with a foot and mouth disease outbreak.
Okay. Thank you.
I would mirror what Dr. Beckham and Mr. Accord have said. The key is early detection and taking care of things as soon and as quickly as possible. The quicker that we stop the spread of any such disease, the less economic impact that we're going to have. And so to me, that's really the key, is getting on top of this as quickly as possible and doing everything we can to have a response plan in place, whether it's vaccination or other measures to really get on top of this and prevent it from spreading.
Thank you. Mr. Accord, in your testimony, you acknowledge that every passenger and handbag entering the United States has the potential to import a disease that could harm the agricultural industry. In your opinion, is the United States doing enough to keep diseases and pests out of the United States, and what should be done? What more should be done?
Well, I think the effort has improved dramatically to address this issue. We're looking at an almost impossible job. I've spent a lot of time at the Miami International Airport, and I take pork producers there all the time so that they can see what's intercepted at the Port of Miami. In a few days, you have a mountain of intercepted material. And it's unbelievable what people want to bring in, and they have all kinds of opportunity to declare that they have something, but they don't. I saw one passenger from Venezuela was literally bringing a grocery store in her suitcase and said they have nothing. And thank goodness for the dogs. One of the positive things that has happened, and I never thought I'd say this at the time, but moving the agriculture inspectors to the Bureau of Customs and Border Protection was a very, very smart move. When I talk to those inspectors now, they tell me that the improved enforcement authority that they have through the customs laws has contributed immensely to their ability to do their job. We have to spend more time at the country of origin and the country of departure rather than the border. That's literally our second line of defense. We're going to have to put more people in these countries if we expect to have any possibility of finding out what's going into these products in the first place. That is, like I said about the PED. However that got in, that same pathway is open for something like FMD, for which we have no vaccine. So we have to direct more resources to country of origin, I think.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Payne. The chair now recognizes Mr. Donovan from New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Accord, Mr. Payne and I would like you to visit Newark International Airport as well, please. That's our airport. Everyone here has spoken about early detection, and it's so multifaceted when you think about homegrown products and livestock, imported products and livestock. How are we doing this early detection? First, maybe we could do it domestically. Are the people on the ground trained to detect, or do we wait until someone gets sick and then try to find out the origin of that illness? How is it that we're doing early detection? And certainly, if we are doing it, whatever methods we're using now, how could they be improved? And I open that up to the panel.
Member Donovan, I would suggest that takes place at the state and local level. The state animal health officials, my team within the veterinary division that is on the ground every day with pork producers, with poultry producers, with beef and dairy producers. We're out there seeing animals, we're talking to the producers, we're working closely with private practitioners. That's where we will detect the disease the earliest, and rightly that should be the case. We're in touch with everything that goes on in our respective states. Dr. Beckham worked closely to develop a program 3 years ago called Enhanced Passive Surveillance, which was a means of identifying diseases early in animal agriculture production. It was almost like emergency room visits that were recorded and tracked on a day-to-day basis. So we have to make sure that capability exists, and I'm going to suggest that DHS has a unique role in all of this, and of course I draw upon my 7 years in the Office of Health Affairs, but USDA has a significant regulatory responsibility. DHS has a significant threat reduction responsibility and should work to enhance capabilities all across the country in preparedness and response. And a perfect example of that would have been the Center for Domestic Preparedness in Anniston, Alabama, the Ag ERT program, the Ag Emergency Response Training Program. After 5 years of successful operation, FEMA discontinued funding for that program because it was perceived as a non-issue for our country. Obviously, it remains an issue and will be an issue. So DHS should step up and appropriately so work on the threat side, work on the preparedness side, work on the response side with states all over the country.
Doctor?
I would just echo what Dr. Mackey said and say that of the veterinarians that we're training every day in the colleges of veterinary medicine and the ones that are out practicing are really the first line response. Early detection is multifaceted, so it's heavily dependent on the producers recognizing there's something wrong, calling that veterinarian, getting them out there, and then through this system that Dr. Mackey's mentioned, we had the capability of collecting that information on mobile devices and bringing that in, and having veterinarians have the capability to share that through mobile devices as well. So if they're seeing something that's unusual in one area, they can share it with each other and say, hey, is anybody else seeing this? And those are the kinds of systems we have to develop, and those are the kinds of systems we have to implement if we're going to have a comprehensive program for early detection that really relies on the first responders, the veterinarians, and the producers, that then works with our state veterinarians to get all that information back.
Is it more difficult to detect a disease in our grown products, our agricultural products, than it is livestock? It sounds like it's not that it's easy to detect with livestock, but it seems like there may be more signs.
You'll see clinical signs, right?
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, I would agree with Dr. Beckham and Dr. Mekas. I think the private practitioner is the first person that's going to be the one to find a foreign animal disease in the U.S. The pork industry spends a great deal of time talking to our producers. We have educational material that they are provided that encourages them to report any unusual conditions that they observe to both their local veterinarian and subsequent to their veterinarian to the state veterinarian. We have a foreign animal disease diagnostic training program at Plum Island Animal Disease Center, where foreign animal disease diagnosticians are trained to recognize the symptoms of disease. That certainly could be expanded to include a larger number of people, because it is very unique training where they actually get to see the disease. These animals are infected with foot and mouth disease, so they can see firsthand the symptoms. I think we have a start, I guess is how I would characterize it.
My time has expired. I'd like to, if we do a second round, ask you about how we do this detection for things that we import. But, Madam Chair, I yield the rest of my time, which isn't any.
Thank you, Mr. Donovan. The chair now recognizes Ms. Watson-Coleman from New Jersey for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I have a number of questions which have been prompted from just listening in and out. We talked about detection, and we're talking about elimination, we're talking about vaccines. I want to go before that. Are there standards that people who grow crops have to follow, people who grow livestock have to follow? Are there standards to ensure that these products are being grown and these livestock are being bred and surviving under certain standards that are for safety? Is there such a thing? And if so, who's responsible for policing that or monitoring that? What is the process for that?
Well, I'll say first and foremost that the marketplace drives those standards. If you're a producer of pork, if you're a beef producer, if you're a dairyman producing milk every day, you want to meet those market standards to be assured that your product can go to market.
Yeah, that's taste and stuff. I'm talking about, are there standards that you can only grow in this kind of soil this? You have to do this in order to protect a plant that is growing. If it's livestock, they can only be bred under certain circumstances. They can only be fed under certain circumstances, way that you would prevent diseases and things of that nature, as opposed to waiting till something happens and then have the capacity to detect it. I just want to know if there's any such thing.
Well, in the pork industry, we have what's known as a Pork Quality Assurance Program, which sets some standards that determine issues like animal welfare, animal health monitoring, those kind of things. That does exist, and there's a great deal of education of producers that goes into implementing that program.
Who monitors that that's actually happening? Are those federal standards?
No, ma'am, they're not
just
they're not
industry
federal
standards.
They're industry standards. And I would suggest to you that there would be a great reluctance and an absolute opposition by producers to be confined by any kind of federal standards as to how they produce, raise livestock and produce crops. That's, I think the industry would view that as probably as un-American, quite honestly, to see that.
Even if the even if the goal is to make sure that livestock and veggies and whatever are produced in a healthy way, so that you don't have these various diseases.
I don't think you can regulate industry or production of anything to that extent. There aren't enough resources to monitor how that's done. And quite honestly, we can pass all kinds of regulations. It's the ability to enforce those regulations that makes a difference.
Yeah, and I was kind of trying to get at that also. Yeah. Are there standards? Who monitors? Should there be monitoring? And you're saying that such a thing isn't very viable in the industry, And I know that the producers would probably resist it, but I'm just wondering, does government have a role in that? And if so, what would it be? But I can go on to some other areas because, and I think it was you, Mr. Accord, I think you said that there's no FMD vaccine. Does that mean you have none stockpiled or none exists? Because there is no vaccine? I don't know.
Well, there's a limited availability of vaccine.
So there is a vaccine, but it's not available.
At Plum Island Animal Disease Center is where the U.S. maintains its bank, and that's the bank for North America. And, Canada, Mexico, and U.S. all would use it. The antigen is stored there because the law prohibits live FMD virus on the U.S. mainland. That antigen is shipped to Europe, where it's manufactured into finished vaccine, shipped back to the U.S. But it has such few strains. The problem with it is that the antigen has a shelf life.
That's what I was going to ask you.
And after 5 years, the potency of vaccine starts to go down, and after 10 years, it's not all that effective, quite honestly, and the companies don't even want to touch the manufacturer at that point.
Okay. So one thing that I read is that there are so many entities and agencies involved in this whole discussion that we're having today, Madam Chairman. And I need to understand what would be the most efficient involvement of agencies and the most efficient collaboration that could take place that is information sharing and facilitated and not impeding and not delayed because there are just so many cooks in that pot. And I guess I'd have to wait until the next round to hear the answer to that. But that certainly is something that I think we need to be exploring. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Walker from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Insider threat seems to be a significant danger to the food and agricultural sector. If there was an attack, would we be able to establish a chain of command? Is there any kind of protocol? Maybe Dr. Beckham, would you touch on that, or Dr. Mekas, either one?
I'm going to let Dr. Mekas because
Okay.
they handle it at the state level typically. So.
Okay.
We follow the incident command structure to respond to any incident, whether it's a hurricane, a tornado. We have just spent the last 7 months preparing for the introduction of high-path AI in North Carolina, which thankfully has not come to pass. But we developed our entire incident command structure to address every issue associated with an outbreak of high-path avian influenza, everything from burial and disposal to the movement of lab samples to the laboratory for testing, routing of vehicles to make certain that we can effectively continue to move product and maintain some continuity of business even in the face of a disease outbreak. So the FEMA's incident command structure is the hierarchy by which we will operate, and practically speaking, every Department of Ag across the country is familiar at some level with this incident command structure.
Well, certainly being a little privileged to North Carolina situation, being our home base, North Carolina is ranked at the top, or at least in the top 5, really in all areas of this emergency preparedness. And to commend your work on behalf of doing your part in the agriculture side to keep us highly ranked.
Well, it hasn't been my work, it's been my predecessors. I've thankfully walked into a well-oiled machine to respond to incidents.
Well, as we've seen around here and at the state level, you have to have good people to keep those machines going, otherwise they can end abruptly. What about getting outside of North Carolina? Are you familiar, does anybody want to address that? Across the country, in our Agriculture Emergency Operations Center, are we seeing good capability across the country? Are we being followed as a model? Can anybody address that?
There's a spectrum of capability across the country, a wide spectrum, and I think, again, that's where DHS has a role in working towards, with USDA. Now, when I say DHS, we always were diligent in making sure that we cooperated, coordinated, and collaborated with our sister departments and agencies in addressing any of these issues. We held a foot and mouth disease outbreak with FEMA Region 7 in December of 2013, and every player was at the table, the states, the locals, and DHS and HHS for that matter. So It has to be an integrated effort, but DHS does have a significant role and an important role in driving preparedness and response capability.
I had a final question, but I'm not so sure that I want to ask it publicly. It may come back with you when it talks about America's food agricultural sector. Where's the most vulnerable target that we have to agroterrorism? But that may be a question better not shared publicly. So with that, I'm going to yield back the balance of my time back to the Madam Chairman.
Thank you, the gentleman those back. We will, I think, be voting soon, but I want to give an opportunity for a second round here until votes are called. Appreciate the thoughtful questions and discussion so far. One concern we've seen across many industries with the rise of terrorism and ISIS and the homegrown extremism is the potential use of drones for some sort of attack. And it doesn't take much imagination to consider how, I mean, people are getting these for Christmas and they're much cheaper and easier to buy now, how that could be used in such a way to deliver something to a crop or to a farm, to have an agroterrorism attack. Is that something that is even being looked at all by any of you? And any ideas and considerations for addressing this difficult threat?
I don't, while it's an additional potential for introduction of disease, I don't see it creating anything new because agriculture is so open, animal production is so open, there's access to farmland and to barns, rather easily, so I don't think that's it's going to pose anything additional in terms of worry for the agriculture industry.
Chairman, I will share with you that during the PEDS virus outbreak, which began in April of 2013 and arrived in North Carolina shortly thereafter, that our colleagues in the environmental realm used drones to surveil disposal of piglets that had died all throughout eastern North Carolina. So that was a concern. We obviously did our best to make certain that we didn't create an environmental problem associated with an agricultural disease outbreak, but who knows where this goes in the future. It may well be a concern.
Yeah, I mean, they can be used positively as well, obviously, for surveillance. So one question, Dr. Beckham, I have a lot of friends who are veterinarians, and so this is more anecdotal, both small animal and large animal, but one thing that they share is there's fewer and fewer people that are choosing that field of work. It's becoming more and more expensive. They're going, like a lot of higher education, but they're going significantly into debt, and it's a bit of a deterrent to even choose the field. So part of making sure that we're ready in this area is making sure that we have the next generation being trained up. I know at the University of Arizona, anyway, they're trying to do a bit of an innovative program to compress the number of years for the bachelor's and moving on from there, and also something innovative that would impact rural communities where an individual would be graduate as a doctor in veterinary medicine, but also have a nurse practitioner's license so that the human-animal bridge could be addressed in some of these rural areas. I think some of those innovations would actually help in this area as well. Are there any other innovative ideas out there? I think that's an interesting model, perhaps, or are you concerned about the pipeline and training of the next generation?
So I'm incredibly concerned about it, which is actually why I went to Kansas State University to be the dean there. I think it's something as a profession we have to address. We're producing about 80% small animal veterinarians for a variety of reasons, and we're losing the expertise that's going back to detect these, to work in the livestock systems and production animal medicine. And there's a whole host of reasons why that's happening. We as a profession have to come together and look at novel, innovative ways to get students in and out with less student loan debt. We have to give them additional skill sets, like you mentioned, the nurse practitioner. We at Kansas State University pride ourselves on the fact that we still have one of the locations that produce quite a bit of students that go out into production animal medicine. We have a rural veterinary loan program where we will pay tuition for those that agree to go back into Kansas and work in rural areas, and we have to continue to look at novel, innovative ways to do that. And so we are starting to look at that as well. How do you compress the time it takes a student to get in and then get out? Are there ways that we can do it more efficient, and those types of things? But we as a profession have to take a look at that across the United States, and that's something I think we're starting to do, but I don't know that we've done that aggressively enough.
I'd encourage you to take a look at what they're doing from the bottom up, groundbreaking at the University of Arizona, because it seems like it's pretty innovative. Where a program doesn't exist, it's easier to create an innovative one as opposed to trying to change a program. So that kind of, sharing best practices, I think, would help. I want to, again, because I know we're going to vote, so I'll yield back the balance of my time, and I'll recognize Mr. Payne for another 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let's see. Mr. Williams, you mentioned biosecurity measures developed by the poultry industry following the avian flu outbreak, and how the model developed by the poultry industry can be applied across various agricultural industries. Can you elaborate on the best way for the public and the private sectors to help drive participation and adopt biosecurity measures that are mutually beneficial to each other?
Well, just to kind of talk a little bit more about what I've seen in the state of Mississippi, after the avian influenza outbreak a year ago, producers were incredibly concerned. And so they were very willing to come to the table and to work with the state veterinarian, to work with the USDA, to work with APHIS in developing these plans. And I think really what it comes down to is we need a boots on the ground approach. These producers that we were talking to, that we were discussing with this over the summer, we were giving them signs to look for. And that's something that our veterinarians can really help with, is not only with poultry, but with beef cattle, with the pork industry. Tell them and inform them, what do we need to look for signs of a potential outbreak. And then when you see these signs, when you see these symptoms, report them immediately to your state veterinarian, to your local veterinarian, and have it investigated. We were even talking about backyard birds, backyard poultry farmers, or backyard poultry operations. If you see something, report it immediately. And that's really the system that they've started to get in place to recognize things as quickly as we possibly can, to get on top of it, to quarantine the area, and to localize it as much as possible.
Okay. So if you see something, say something, right?
Exactly.
May I comment, sir?
Sure.
The pork industry has always prided itself on having a very good biosecurity system. And that is because of the structure of the industry. We know that we're more vulnerable to disease. But at the same time, while we thought we had the perfect system, when we had the PED outbreak, we discovered a lot of holes in that system. And we've begun working on those. The other point I want to make, and it hasn't been brought up here, is we have a huge threat from urban animal agriculture. It's unbelievable how much poultry, even now into potbelly pigs, into sheep and goats in some places that are kept in urban environments. They totally escape the animal health network and are the most vulnerable to disease introduction. And that's an area that we have to start paying much more attention to than we have up to this point. We've had problems with live bird markets in New York and places like that. But that's nothing compared to what we saw in Los Angeles when we had exotic Newcastle disease in poultry there. So that's another vulnerability that we haven't looked at hard enough.
Thank you. Dr. Beckham, it's my understanding that Kansas State partnered with FEMA to develop an animal disease outbreak training course. Can you describe how KSU is working with FEMA to push out this training opportunity?
I think that falls under the Biosecurity Research Institute, where they're actually using that facility to train veterinarians on signs and clinical symptoms for foreign animal diseases. And so it's a novel use of that facility to be able to bring veterinarians in and provide that kind of training there in Kansas. So it's really unique, and it aligns closely, obviously, with what happens at the Plum Island Animal Disease Center. So the more we can do those kinds of things outside of containment in Plum Island and demonstrate those types of diseases, and whether it's using plastintized material or tissues to do that, that's at least one component of training a cadre of veterinarians that can go out there and do that. And there are many of those foreign animal disease diagnostic practitioner courses that happen at Colorado State as well. So they also happen other places in the U.S. So there's the FADD course, the Foreign Animal Disease Diagnostician course at Plum Island, and then there's other courses that happen around the U.S. at K-State, at Colorado State, that use different technologies to teach the same type of information.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Donovan from New York.
We're being told votes are going to be in about 2 minutes, so let me just ask the question I wanted to ask in the first round about, we spoke about domestic detection. Since we import so many products, where is our importation detection? Where are we making the detections internationally for products being brought into the country?
I can speak from the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service standpoint that a risk assessment is done anytime there is a request to import or to export a commodity from another country to the U.S. They're asked to provide a lot of information about the existence of a disease within their country. What kind of surveillance do they have? Do they have competent authority? Do they have enough veterinarians to deal with the disease? Those kind of fundamental questions. And sometimes it results in a site visit, most often actually a site visit to go look at the country and see if what they're telling the U.S. is true. And then there's a formal risk assessment that's done. But there are a lot of products that are getting into this country that are not getting the kind of review in country that they need from the standpoint of the manufacturer of those products. So we have a gap in that area, and not enough is being done. We cannot rely on the port of entry as being the first line of defense. That's not going to work. We've proven that.
And you're speaking about cooperative countries. If something is introduced into our imported foods purposefully, all the help with the exporting country isn't going to help.
Sure.
So are we doing any detection methods for products coming in aside from relying on the exporting country that you're aware of?
There's a group within DHS that as Bobby mentioned, reviews product shipping invoices on a day-to-day basis and inspects those that have the greatest risk or the greatest perceived risk. But that being said, less than 2% of all products imported in the U.S. are inspected in any form, physically inspected in any form or fashion. So, Mr. Donovan, you're correct. Someone with less than stellar intent could intentionally bring something into this country that would never be physically observed.
Maybe, as my colleague Mark Walker said, maybe we should have said that publicly. Madam Chair, I think that was the vote call. I'll waive the remainder of my time.
Okay, great. Mr. Donovan, gentleman yields back. Just, in closing, in my time in the military, we'd always talk about threat equals capability plus intent. Clearly, we've heard today from our witnesses the capabilities are there. We do also know that the intent is there for potential agroterrorism attack. We do know, I was looking back at my notes, in 2002, we've had a Navy SEAL team raid al-Qaeda storehouse caves in Afghanistan, finding documents how to carry out a terror attack on America's agriculture. As you mentioned, Dr. Beckham, these types of agents naturally exist in places controlled by ISIS, Boko Haram, al-Shabaab, and others. And I, quote former Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tommy Thompson, when he, in his farewell address, when he left in 2004, which is 12 years ago, he said, quote, "For the life of me, I cannot understand why the terrorists have not targeted our food supply because it is so easy to do." Again, we hold this hearing not to instill fear in the American public, but to raise awareness on what the threats are, what the capabilities are, what the intent is, and identify what we can do as a federal government, but working closely with the private sector, states, local authorities, and academia in order to address these vulnerabilities and these threats in order to keep our country, our food supply, our agricultural system, safe and secure from these types of threats. So that was a great hearing, and I appreciate all the witnesses' testimony today. I do want to say, as I'm closing out my final hearing here, You are all in good hands. Handing over the gavel to Mr. Donovan. It's been a pleasure to be chairing this subcommittee. Enjoyed working with Ranking Member Payne. Again, I'll be remaining on the subcommittee, but we'll continue to move forward on some of these really pressing issues. I want to thank all the witnesses for their expertise in this area, your hard work, and your testimony today. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses. We'll ask you to respond to these in writing. Pursuant to the Committee Rule 7E, the hearing record will be open for 10 days. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned. See?
Good to see you again, Tammy. We don't see as much of you since you left A&M.
They won't let her.
They just